Muhammad Syed Tantawi is a leading Islamic theologian, the Grand Imam at Al-Azhar University, and his doctoral thesis is a fiery anti-Semitic treatise. I'll be speaking with Dr. Andrew Bosstom, who has a new book out about Tantawi's theology. Hello and welcome to Gatekeeper, שומר סף. הפרק הזה הוא באנגלית. אם יותר נוח לכם בעברית, אז תעברו לוידאו. And my guest today is Andrew Bosstom, who is a physician, an MD, and who became a voice in the discussion about Islam and now has a new book about called A Modern Qur'anic Kampf, that's Hitler's term, of course, against the Jews. Andrew, welcome to Gatekeeper. It's a pleasure to have you.
Wonderful to talk to you, Guy.
So this book has to do with one of the leading imams in the Islamic world. He was the chief imam at Al-Azhar University, Muhammad Syed Tantawi, and he caught your attention because of his treatise against the Jews.
Yes, well, he passed suddenly. He actually had a myocardial infarction in 2010 in Saudi Arabia. But I was aware.
He had what? Was that something that you take care of?
Heart attack.
Heart attack.
Sudden death, sudden cardiac death. No, so he passed away in Saudi Arabia in 2010.
Andrew, you could have helped, but you didn't, as your profession. Yeah.
I don't know how welcome I would have been in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, probably.
A friend of mine once tried to establish a cardiac catheterization lab there and had a very unpleasant experience. That was a long time ago. Maybe it's changed a little bit. A Jew, of course. I had been familiar with his work really from the time of the Second Intifada, and when I started to follow what was going on in the Muslim world. I was struck, certainly after 9/11, by how anti-Semitic some of his public statements were. And when I wrote the Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, which came out in 2008, I had included significant extracts from this PhD thesis, which was defended in 1966 and published in 1968.
His PhD.
Yes,
Tantawi's PhD.
Which translates into English as the Jews in the Quran and the traditions. And so,
tell us, just before we delve into it, tell us about the persona and why this specific person is so important.
So Tantawi, his just highlights of his personal biography. He had a prodigious memory. He was a hafiz as a child, which means he memorized the entire Quran. He went on and became part of Al-Azhar's sort of secondary school system, and then ultimately got a master's from Al-Azhar and his PhD thesis through Al-Azhar, and he was focused on studying the Quran and the Quranic commentaries and the traditions. He became the Grand Mufti of Egypt for 10 years, from 1986 to 1996, and then was appointed Grand Imam, and that's where he served until he passed. And I would say that the importance of the work is that he's not a marginal figure. He's not a radical figure. In fact, Gotti, the arguments could be made, and they were made certainly by journalists and by diplomatic kind of apologists, that he was quote unquote a liberal. And the evidence of that is that his daughter, for example, he was very proud of the fact that she became a physician. So he had no opposition to Muslim women advancing themselves in terms of their education. He opposed the niqab, the face veil, the full face veil. He also opposed female genital mutilation, which was very, very edgy for a Grand Imam in Egypt, because
where 90 or 80% of women go through that, right?
Exactly, Gadi. The predominant school of Islamic law in Egypt is the Shafi'ite school, and they mandate FGM. Other schools do not mandate it. So the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, hated him for those reasons, but they extolled him at the same time for his PhD thesis, which kind of gives you a hint as to what's in that PhD thesis. And they actually did their own republication of his thesis in the mid-1980s. The thesis that we translated was Tantawi's republication in 1997 as Grand Imam, which he himself reintroduced, and he says quite plainly he still believes in everything in that PhD thesis. He's saying this as Grand Imam. So we felt that it was particularly important to include that reintroduction, and then of course go back and translate the entire work, because I didn't want to say that I wouldn't want to be accused of taking things out of context. I had published extracts from it almost 20 years earlier, and I wanted the thesis out there in its entirety. The other
you read it in translation. You work with a translator.
I worked with a full-time academic Arabic instructor who happens to be a Coptic Christian, so he knew Tantawi's dialect. He was really an ideal translator in this setting. And I must say, anecdotally, Atef Gobriel, who teaches at Boston College, almost turned the project down after translating the first introduction and the first two chapters. He wrote to me, he said, "Andy, I don't know if I can go on. I've never read anything so venomous in my life." So I had to live, but he finished the job. He finished the job.
How long is it? How long is the whole thesis?
In Arabic, originally, it was about 760 pages.
Wow.
It took him a year to translate it between his other academic responsibilities. And then it took me another year to really delve into it, read it word for word in English, and then begin the process that took me over 200 pages of contextualizing it and annotating it and seeing how it related to, not just to summarize it, but how it related to the many Quranic commentaries and traditions that he referred to, and then tie it into some contemporary phenomena. And also the milieu that it came out of, Gadi, is very important, because in between 1947 and then right before his thesis came out, there were three major fatwas from Al-Azhar University which declared a jihad against Israel, against the Jews of Israel, to be joined by the entire global Muslim Ummah. And as the thesis was published in 1968, after for the Arabs, certainly the debacle of the 1967 war, there was a very important conference held, which is also part of this milieu, by Al-Azhar. It brought together literally the entire Muslim world in, I think it was September of 1968. And the conference proceedings were summarized. I don't know if you're familiar with Yehoshaphat Harkaby, but also one of my mentors, David Littman. David saw the English proceedings from this conference in a library in London in 1935 and went through the whole thing. So the conference is 68, the translation is 1970. And David was aghast and very frightened by what he read in this 935-page proceedings. It was, in other words, the veneer of sort of pseudo-secular Arab nationalism as a guiding spirit in the confrontation with Israel was completely being abandoned. It was pure jihad. It was rife with very anti-Semitic themes from the Quran and the traditions. And David said that he concluded, he and Fadi wrote a pamphlet about 100 pages called called The Arab Theologians on Jews and Israel. And they concluded that with extracts, from this 935-page work, that there were two major themes, that there was the politicide or policidal nature of it, to destroy Israel as a political entity, and also the destruction of the Jews, really genocidal. And so David felt it was very important to get it out there, at least in extracts, and that is the precise milieu that Tantawi comes out of and elaborates on at great length in his PhD thesis.
So what's in it?
So it's 8 chapters plus a concluding chapter, which is basically the jihad in Palestine. And I would say the first 6.5 chapters, he walks you through, after a very brief introduction, his introduction at least, to the history of the Jews, in the Holy Land. It's kind of a brief chapter. It's not exactly, historically accurate, but at least he takes a stab at it. The bulk of the book is to develop really the perfidious nature of the Jews through all the Muslim sources, the major Muslim sources, the Quran in particular, the traditions, but also he goes to great length bringing in classical Quranic commentaries, and I think that's one of the strengths of the book is that Tantawi it refuses to concede that his interpretations are unique, that he's really just in a sense collating the classical interpretations and maybe to a certain extent updating them. But it's very dark, Agadi, and at the beginning of chapter 6, I just want to read you a key extract, and he has all the Quranic citations. I won't bore you with those, but he says, the reader of the Noble Quran will clearly see that it has depicted many of the inappropriate conducts, despicable manners, and cunning and crooked behaviors that the children of Israel indulged in. It has branded them with disbelief. That's Quran 446. But each one of these negative, pejorative characteristics has a Quranic citation. Branded them with disbelief, ingratitude, egotism, cowardice, deceit, rebellion, transgression, cruelty, deviance, hastening to transgression and aggression, unjustly consuming people's wealth, and many more of the vices that are recorded in the Noble Quran. They therefore earned Allah's displeasure, were stripped of Allah's mercy and compassion, and they were stricken with disgrace and misery. This is a critical central theme from the second and third surahs of the Quran. And then he says, these vices that the Noble Quran recorded can be clearly seen anywhere and throughout the ages. The passage of time has only made these vices more ingrained and rooted in them. And so what he does with the first, say, 6.5 chapters, Gadi, and this is what was new to me as someone who had just been familiar with some of the extracts that had been taken out of it. He develops those themes at great length, and it's very tedious and very depressing to read. But then what he does, which was, I thought, remarkable, and I was not really aware of till the full translation, he melds those themes to every, I would say this honestly, Gadi, every crackpot Western conspiracy theory from medieval Christianity to the protocols of the Elders of Zion to things I had not even heard of, that the Jews were responsible for the French Revolution, that Marcus Aurelius was influenced by the Jews to slaughter the Christians in pagan Rome. I mean, on and on. We were responsible for poisoning the Russian population with alcohol. I mean, and what he does, Gadi, and what's so important is that he says, well, these are all footnotes. If you understood the Islamic tradition, you would know that these are very predictable behaviors. So, in a sense, he's adamant about putting the lie to the notion that anti-Semitism, he wouldn't refer it that way, but what he's saying is that anti-Semitism in the Muslim world is not a byproduct of the West. It's indigenous, and proudly so.
So is it true to say that he basically sees the Jews as responsible for most calamities that humanity suffered? The Jews are the evil engine of, Satan working through history, something like that?
Yes, and you know there are very specific references to Satan in the Quran that he refers to, and that have been referred to by jurists in the past. But
Are the Jews curable according to his view?
Yes.
Could they
Yes, they
convert
are.
and be forgiven?
Exactly. That's it. So in other words, and in fact, one of the gravest sins of the Jews, which is remedied only by the few enlightened Jews that have existed in history, is to recognize that Islam is the fulfillment of Judaism. That if Jews had read their scriptures properly, they would have readily converted to Islam and seen Muhammad as their prophet too. And so the handful that have done this over the ages are the only really enlightened Jews.
And is there a direct call for the physical liquidation of those who won't convert?
Yeah, I would say that because, and here's where you get to see symmetries that are very ugly symmetries. In that last chapter, which is basically about the jihad against Israel in all the territories that comprise historical Palestine, he invokes the same canonical hadith of the infamous rocks and trees hadith for Jew annihilation, which of course is in the seventh part of the seventh Hamas article. Sorry, Hamas article in their covenant was also unearthed by Haj Amin al-Husseini when he wrote his infamous fatwa against the Jews in 1937. And
could you just repeat that hadith for those who are not, for those for whom it doesn't ring a bell, the call of the trees and the stones?
Yeah. So what I'm paraphrasing, but what Muhammad says, and again it's Muhammad says that to usher in the Messianic age, the end of times, the rocks and trees will call out, "O Muslim, there's a Jew behind me. Come and kill him." And again, it is part of Islamic eschatology, end of times theology, and it's also very similar. And again, the symmetry here too is not just between Tantawi's PhD thesis and the Hamas covenant, but it's also with this tract that was produced by the late Ayatollah Khamenei called Palestine. It was a summary of his writings over several decades, which came out in about 2014. And what is riveted upon in all three of these works, again, Tantawi's being the longest, is that there's got to be a global jihad to destroy Israel as a political entity, and also from either the Sunni in the case of Tantawi and the Hamas covenant, or the Shiite perspective in the case of Khamenei, is that the Jews need to be annihilated individually to usher in the Messianic age. And those themes are very apparent in all three of those works. And I think it's a very disturbing symmetry.
Is a non-anti-Semitic form of Islam, does that have any traction that we should assign weight to in the Muslim world? Is there a moderate Islam that Jews can reach out to?
So I would put it this way: I think there are individual Muslims, and they struggle with this corpus of anti-Semitic work, and they obviously don't want to abide it. But we see them in the West. Sometimes we even see them in the Muslim world. But to say that there's any kind of organized movement, I don't see one. And B, part of the problem that other than the Muslims that fully apostatize, Gadi, I mean, they are explicit. They are very, very brutally honest about the problem of anti-Semitism in Islam, and they identify it. And they identify it, I wouldn't say proudly, but at least openly. In other words, they will refer to the specific motifs in the Quran, the traditions, the Quranic commentaries that are virulently anti-Semitic, as Tantawi compiles in this massive work. They are very open about it. Unfortunately, what I've seen of the Muslim reformers is that they tend to ignore it. It's more a form of revisionism, and just say that they have the proper interpretation, regardless of what the authorities have said over the millennia.
So you don't subscribe to Obama's depiction of Islam as a religion of peace. I'm beginning to sense.
No, nor if you notice, one of the first trips he made outside the United States was, in fact, to Cairo. I don't know if he spoke specifically at Al-Azhar, but he had a whole cadre of Al-Azhar clerics, including the Grand Imam there at the time, and talked about what a benevolent and enlightened institution Al-Azhar was. And I certainly don't get a flavor of that. Plus, God, you have to remember how Al-Azhar reacted now to October 7th, for example. And the Grand Imam that succeeded Tantawi, who's Ahmed al-Tayeb, on the day that the gruesome massacres were occurring, in the middle of them, the body count hadn't reached its gruesome full toll yet. They issued a statement praising the quote proud resistance of the Palestinian people. Not a syllable about the carnage that those proud people were inflicting. And then about the 18th, 19th of October 2023, another one of these litanies of formal fatwas was issued by Al-Azhar, stating that because so many Jews in all walks of life serve in the IDF, the lives of all of them were licit targets for jihad. And then, of course, boilerplate anti-Semitic statements coming out from, not specifically from Tayeb himself, but obviously from Al-Azhar, referring to Qur'anic epithet, the Jews as apes and pigs, and corruptors and prophet killers, all in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. Nothing about the suffering of the Jews.
Shortly after October 7, I interviewed some experts on Islam that were predictably ousted from universities, often for just saying the truth. And they said it's not just that many were supported the so-called act of resistance, but that they also reveled in the violence. That is, the gruesome violence of chopping off a child's foot and opposite hand in the orgy of violence was not an accidental act of violence, but actually a reenactment of something that Muhammad did. And
that's Quran 533, Gadi.
Explain what that is.
In other words, it's gruesome, period, but it's particularly gruesome to do that to an innocent child when even in the Quran, it's supposed to be the remedy for highway robbers that kill people. In other words, to apply that to an innocent child is beyond the pale.
But how do you're a physician, not a psychologist, but still you work in the health professions, and people. How is it possible to create in a person's mind the state in which he would call his mother, as he is murdering Jews with his own bloodied hands, and that is not a metaphor, and be proud of it and receive his mother's praise? Do you see a connection between the virulence of the theology that you have studied in this book and in previous books you wrote, and the mental attitude that enables you to commit horrendous cruelty and be proud of it?
Yes, unfortunately. I think there is a direct nexus. I don't want to say, Gadi, that it's the only factor that contributes to such barbaric behavior. I think there are societal mores, particularly, and this conflict has simmered for 100 years now, that obviously contribute. But on the other hand, Gadi, when you have, for example, the organization of the Quran can be very confusing to the novice. It certainly was to me before I got into study, because it doesn't have a chronological narrative. It literally goes, so there's 114 surahs. The second surah to the 114th chapters is basically longest to shortest. So it becomes a hodgepodge. It's very hard to, there's no chronological narrative like the Old Testament, like the Gospels, etc. But the first chapter is spatchcocked onto it, and it violates that principle. It's very short. It's only 7 verses. But though it's called the Fatiha, the opening, that is supposed to be repeated by pious Muslims. You can see the directive in the Hadith. 17.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. I think I don't know, in school. I didn't.
But the seventh verse talks about so you follow the path of Islam. The 7th verse says, not the path of those who've incurred Allah's anger and those who've gone astray. And Muhammad had told Muslims in a hadith that those who've incurred Allah's anger are the Jews. And the Qur'anic commentaries across space and time for 1,000 years, about 90% of them make that specific reference that those who've incurred Allah's anger are the Jews. To repeat that 17 times a day is itself a form of indoctrination. And of course, that verse is tied to verses about the Jews as prophet killers, about the Jews as sowing corruption, about the Jews as being cursed as apes and pigs. And so I think obviously the religious indoctrination is very important, and it comes from above and from below. It comes from street corner preachers, and it comes from Al-Azhar University. But I don't think that we can say that that's the only thing that contributes to some of the barbarity that we witnessed on October 7th. But certainly it has to be a consideration.
Andrew, to conclude, tell me a little bit about yourself. You've been writing these things for a while. When did you, and as I said, you're a physician, not a historian. When did you get bitten by the bug of studying Islam?
My wife was literally on the treadmill with our second child, pregnant, well into her pregnancy when the first plane hit the World Trade Center. And then the second plane, and she called me at work and said, this is obviously not an accident. And driving home, and we grew up in New York. We were now living in Rhode Island at the time that she was pregnant. We lived here since 1990. It was unbelievable to me to hear the apologetic immediately over the radio, and then on television.
Who's apologetics?
The apologetic about what was going on and about how
by American commentators.
American commentators by the President of the United States, that Islam was a religion of peace, and it disturbed me. And my background was not only in clinical medicine, but in epidemiology. And I started out looking at polling data of the Muslim world and its anti-Semitic attitudes, and I also. There was an Al-Azhar envoy. The church calls them the Vatican calls them papal nuncios. Well, Al-Azhar has a comparable position. It's really basically is the Sunni Islamic Vatican, even though things are decentralized in Islam. And they had their envoy was at the Islamic Center of Manhattan when 9/11 occurred. And he was, he gave proper statements, of ecumenical kinds of statements after the attack. But he left suddenly, less than a month after the attacks, and gave an interview in Arabic at an Al-Azhar affiliated website. And I saw the Middle East Media Research Institute translate the extracts from it.
This is
Memory, Yigal Kamon's outfit. And
founded in Israel by Yigal Karmon, who was an advisor to two prime ministers on terrorism. Yeah,
and I was just shocked at the conspiratorial Jew hatred that he was spewing. That after all, I'm a physician. He was accusing American physicians of poisoning Muslims in the hospital in the aftermath of 9/11. And just themes that I later learned, for example, were in Tantawi's PhD thesis, and themes that I've learned that were from the Quran itself. But just crazy conspiratorial Jew hatred from someone who had sounded so ecumenical in the immediate aftermath in English after the attacks occurred. and that he was being persecuted and his family was being persecuted. And of course, the Jews were behind it all.
Have you been personally threatened since you started calling out Muslim anti-Semitism?
I would say it's mostly personal vilification, professional vilification, that kind of thing. But there was one episode where I wound up having to contact the FBI after my first book came out, The Legacy of Jihad, and I happened to do a nationally syndicated program, The Bill O'Reilly Show, on Fox News at the time. And the next day I was told that some Middle Eastern person was searching around the hospital for me. I don't even know if that was actually true or not. But I was advised, and I did contact the FBI and report it. And that was
so. Did it end up hurting your career? Were you?
I think so. I think so. In terms of Gotti, it was much harder. I will say. I mean, I had a very good grant track record before I started writing about Islam in medicine. I ran one of the biggest clinical trials ever conducted in kidney transplant recipients, and it became increasingly difficult after I stared speaking and writing publicly.
But you still work and do your.
No, I retired. I retired in the middle of COVID. Was a good time for me to retire. I wasn't crazy about the COVID response. I spoke out about that too. I actually admired a lot of some of the dissident voices in Israel. But be that as it may, it was just a good time. It was just a good time to get out. And so I've been retired since about 2021.
Andrew Boston, Dr. Andrew Boston, congratulations for your book, A Modern Qur'anic Kampf Against the Jews, and for the general good work that you are doing. It was a pleasure to have you on this show, and I hope to see you when you publish your next work.
Thank you, Guy.